Hi guys, welcome back to the show. Now, some time ago, I started a series called How to Paint a Background for Your Character, and I promised you a part 2 in that series when I found the time. And it's just been Christmas holidays, and I got COVID and was locked in my house. So yeah, you could say I've had some time. So without further ado, I present to you part 2 of How to Paint a Background for Your Character. Now, this is not a perspective tutorial, so I'm not going to go too deep into this, but I am going to address a couple really important points that you need to think about when you're putting your character into a scene. Now, the first thing you're going to want to do is determine where your horizon line is. Now, this is the point where all forms recede towards. So anything that you draw that is above the horizon line, you are looking up at the underside of that object. And anything that is below the horizon line, you're going to be looking down at the top surface of that object. Now this applies to everything that your character is going to be holding or wearing, so keep that in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is that if you rotate an object horizontally, its cube's vanishing points will move along the horizon line, and each object will have their own vanishing points, and these things can go right off the side of the page. But the horizon line always remains the same, so just pay attention to it and make sure you know where it is. Another important thing to think about is that your character and the scene need to have the same perspective. So if you're going to be drawing, say, a large cube here, you should imagine that your character inhabits a cube in the same perspective. So you can put another cube next to it, following the same perspective, and draw your character within that cube. So think about things like that. Every volume within your perspective can reside within a cube of some sort that obeys the perspective of your scene. So with all of that basic perspective in mind, the first thing you want to do when you're trying to draw your character with a scene is to draw a bunch of little thumbnails and just try and understand the composition for your shot. Now we're looking for a good value range, interesting shapes, and we're trying to bring attention to the focal point. And I'm being pretty rough here, nice and quick. I'm just trying to make some thumbnails that are going to describe a few key concepts that you should be trying to think about when you're doing your own compositions. And some of these are better than others, some of them are crap. That's the point of thumbnails, all right? In amongst a sheet of 6 or 8 thumbnails, you're going to have a few real failures and a couple that are good enough that you could reasonably take them to a finish and be happy with the result. And you would be surprised at how much of the image can be contained within this really early, loose thumbnail. In fact, if you were to look at the final image that I get out of this and put it next to the thumbnail that I made of it, you would barely be able to tell the difference at a distance. They look so similar because most of the problems are solved in this phase, which is why it's so important to do this and get it right. Now, apologies for the little skip there. I accidentally paused the recording while I went to do something and forgot to start it. So you missed that last one. But that doesn't matter because this one that I'm working on right now is the one that I end up taking to a final. But I'm going to split the process of detailing that up into a separate video because this one gets long. You see, in the next step, when all of these thumbnails are done, I'm going to talk you through and be a little bit more informative about my decision-making process for each of these compositions and how I'm using the value structures and the shapes and the lines and things like that to sort of draw the viewer's attention to where I want them to look and just sort of give you a breakdown of how I approach my compositions. So I'm just finishing up the last little thumbnail here, and it's a little bit weaker than the other ones because the one I did before, I really liked the shapes and I knew that that was the one I was going to go with. So I'm all done here and it's time to jump over to a real-time discussion just to break down these compositions. Okay, so all of the thumbnails are done now. So we'll just start at the beginning here. So this shot has a black triangle coming up here like this, and then it has this white triangle. Now, obviously this is the area of focus because you're contrasting a very light value with a very dark value. And then I've just repeated shapes within the scene so that it's got this real kind of consistency to its design language. And it's a pretty simple shot. It's very obvious where you want the viewer to look. And this is a dark on light sort of composition, very central. This one here is also very central, but this is kind of just, you've got light on dark. And obviously you're looking here, and as we're moving down through the character to areas that are further away from where I want the viewer to look, what I'm doing is just kind of decreasing the contrast. So there's much less contrast in this area, and then there's a little bit more and more, and you would do the same thing with the detail in this shot. Now, this would be a very simple background. Some characters, maybe you want to put them into a more complicated scene. This is definitely a minimalist approach where you've got a very dark background and you just kind of put in some haze or maybe a few stars or something very sort of subtle in the back, and you really let the character come to the front. So you don't need to go too far with the background because the character is always going to be the main star. This right here, this is the actor, and we need to have everything else in the scene support the actor, right? So this is a really effective way of just bringing the character to the front and getting something in the background that suits the scene. Now this one is pretty obvious and bold, and I love these kind of really graphic things, and the basic armature for this shot would be like a triangle kind of shape and a circle, obviously, and there's no mistaking where you're supposed to look here, right here. And I like the shape design of this one. You've got these big shapes, kind of this big triangular shape, and then you have these other kind of secondary shapes inside. Everything is nice and clear and broken up, and so we've got our character kind of sitting on a roof, and we could have lots of little stars in the background and stuff. A really simple background, really effective, but it's telling a little bit of narrative. Like this posture is saying, you know, I'm just sitting here contemplating something. I want to be alone, you know, alone with my thoughts, and, you know, moon and stars and things like that. Very contemplative. I like this one. So that's a nice simple shot. This one here is a little bit more complicated. So this would probably have a bit more detail in the background. But you still have to make sure that your character is the main event, and you still have to lead the viewer to where you want them to look. So we obviously want the viewer to look here. So we can lighten up the background behind the character because she's got a dark hood on. And we're also going to have this wind blowing in, so we can get these nice swooping kind of lines coming through our composition, leading kind of through the area of interest here that we want the viewer to look. But you don't want just too much of the same. So I've also tried to add in some straighter kind of shapes. You should always be trying to contrast things. So if you're looking at this shot, you're contrasting your lights and your darks against one another, and you're contrasting a round shape against a more angular kind of shape. And that's usually a good rule of thumb, right? Because if you've got a bunch of lines going this way and then you've got one going that way, obviously you're going to notice the one that's going sideways. We are drawn to things that are slightly different than those things around them. So it's quite exciting for the eye to have these straight lines in amongst these more swooping, curving lines. So that's why I've done that. And obviously dark hood, light face, and trying to keep most of the detail and interest around here. This one here, you've got a very vertical kind of character. So I thought, if we've got these kind of swooping vertical kind of energetic lines happening, we should have something coming the other way to contrast the upward motion. So something to kind of hold it down. And some other things going on with this one. So where the sword is in front of the moon here, I've made it darker so that it contrasts against here, and where it moves over the top here, it becomes lighter. Maybe this doesn't make sense from a lighting perspective, but it's going to look a lot better. And who's to say what lights are around in the scene? Like, you're creating the image, and it should look good. I know when I started with art, I got really bogged down in things having to be correct, so there's this moon here would be a light source and he would be very darkly silhouetted. Yeah, that's true, but you know, it doesn't really matter. Just make an image that looks good and don't worry too much about rules. Just make something that looks good. So it's the moon is a bit darker down here, and then I'm getting it really light around here, where the barbarian's head is kind of got nice dark hair, trying to lead the viewer. So this line here goes through the point of interest where we want the viewer to look, and yeah, all of the energetic lines are kind of flowing through there too. Nice and effective, nice and simple. So this one here, I wanted to experiment a little bit because the idea of painting a background for your character is just kind of wrong. It's not the way you should think about this, and I spoke about this in a previous video, but because if you do that, you cannot create an interesting shot like this. And I wanted to just have something that was very much like designing the background with the character. So I imagine some sort of bonfire down here or something, and it's at night, so you're getting lit from below. Now, if you just drew your character and wanted to put a background behind them, you're not going to be able to come up with this idea really to light the character from below and then accurately put it all together. So you really need to think about where your character is, what they're doing, and how you might best describe what you're going for with the character. So with this one, I've just got this kind of very simple shapes, and I've tried to get the smoky embers and stuff to kind of swirl around, but I'm not trying to get the viewer to look at the face really here. This one is more of an anatomy study, right? If I was to finish this one, I would want people to look somewhere around here. I would put most of the interest and then just a little secondary bang of light up there. And you'll notice that I put a little bit of haze behind the character so that I could separate the hair from the background. Just little things like that, light against dark, dark against light. Just always be paying attention to where your values are. This one here, I like this one. This one's pretty cool. And it's kind of simple and effective. I've got these shapes that go like this, and they just kind of point to the focal area, which is this, right? And this whole area, the face and this, but this is the lightest point. And I wanted this sword to stand out in here because I'm using positive and negative space here to sort of build my composition. But if the sword is too light, it's going to detract from where I want people to look. I don't want people looking right in the middle down at this sword, so I had to darken that down and just make this much lighter. And then I could have some bounced light kind of hitting the chin, and then having those creepy eyes under the hood. Now, obviously you've got really clearly defined shapes, these big triangular shapes, and then there's, you know, pointing down here. And then you've got, I put in some background stuff that's just kind of going through the same kind of area, kind of framing, I guess, where I want the viewer to look. Other bits kind of pointing in towards there as well. But one thing that I did do, you'll notice that that it's kind of a bit detail heavy over on this side. So I kind of have a slightly darker value here and a much lighter value over here to make sure that people are kind of hanging around just a little to the left. You can play with your values to kind of balance things. It's much brighter here to be a little bit darker here, just because the character's kind of facing in this direction. So I want the interest to be kind of on this side, and the sword slightly to the left. Just things like that. Always be mindful of how balanced your image feels. If you've got a really dark shape next to a really light shape, that's going to pull a lot of attention. But that happens with all of these other transitional areas as well. And this has less of a gravity to it. It pulls a lot less than a high contrast area like this. So try to use your lighter, higher contrast areas to pull your viewers' attention to where you want them to look. And if you don't want someone to look at a specific area, just have it mushy like this. Low contrast transitions. This one here, I was kind of running out of juice. It's just I thought, okay, we'll do the arch, and then we'll have, you know, dark against light, like light against dark, and we'll try this. There's not really too much going on here. Yeah, just breaking that arch with the staff there, just so it didn't feel too boxed in. I wanted the character to, you know, you should be trying to overlap your forms a little bit to build that illusion of depth. So always be considering those sorts of things. And the little lines, I wanted them to point down towards the character and stuff. So little highlights on the rocks, and yeah. So that one's pretty straightforward. Light, dark. More detail, less detail, and kind of getting darker as you go down towards away from the focal point. So I'd imagine the light coming from above and just hitting the shoulders and the head. And that's pretty much it. So with the basic breakdown of the shots complete, I just wanted to put a very quick kind of color pass over each of them. And I'm not going to get too detailed here. I'm just going for really basic mood coloring. And I just wanted to talk about one thing, because the goal of creating these little compositions is to lead the viewer towards your area of focus. You should always be trying to support that one little spot where you want people to look. And so the way you can do that with your colors is to create variations in color temperature, so warm and cool colors next to one another, and also use complementary colors. So if you have a color wheel, which I'll put up on screen, if you take a color from one side of the color wheel and then put the opposite color next to it, that creates a massive focal point that draws a lot of attention. So you can use this to draw your viewers' attention, along with the more subtle grays and those subtle little temperature shifts. And it's a bit of a balancing act, trying to control the viewer's attention using these different colors. So this one that I'm working on right now, it's a green forest, and I'm going to make the cloak nice and red because they're opposed to one another on the color wheel, and so they attract a lot of attention. So just keep these kind of things in mind while you're working on your image, and try to be very deliberate with the colors that you choose. I remember when I first started, I would start the image and then I would go to put another object into the scene and just think, what color haven't I used in this scene yet? And I would just put some purple down, put some blue down, put some yellow down, and it just makes a mess. Just be very careful and control the colors and make sure they all relate to one another in the scene. So this is what the final sheet looks like at the end. Let me know in the comments down below which one's your favorite. I'm going to detail up that green one. It's just got some nice complementary vibes. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. All that YouTube stuff helps me out a whole lot. And if you do drop a comment, let me know what you liked and what you didn't like about it, and if there was any information that maybe you'd like me to clarify a little bit more. Now, next week, I'm going to be releasing the video where I detail up one of these to completion. So if you want to see how I actually go in and add the detail, where I add those details, and how I play with the values and the color temperature and stuff like that, as I discussed in this episode, jump on over next week and check it out. It's going to be a good one, I promise, and I'll see you there.